What if I told you that the most disrespected person in any room isn't the one who makes mistakes, acts unconventionally, or even offends people? It's the person who constantly explains themselves. You know the type. Justifies every decision, defends every choice, over-explains every action to avoid judgment. Society calls them considerate. Robert Greene called them something else entirely. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this person will never command respect, while people who refuse to explain themselves naturally generate authority and admiration. Or maybe you're that person exhausted from justifying your existence. But first, let me show you exactly what I mean. You're in a meeting, and two people make the same decision. First, there's Amanda, who says, "I'm choosing option B," and then launches into a 5-minute explanation of why, addressing every possible objection, defending her reasoning from every angle, classic over-explainer. Then there's Marcus, who says, "We're going with option B," and stops talking. Who do you respect more in that moment? Hold that thought, because what I'm about to tell you will flip everything you believe about communication and authority. Amanda's explanation made everyone question whether she actually believes in her decision. Marcus's silence made everyone assume he knows something they don't. Amanda's justification invited debate and undermined her authority. Marcus's certainty commanded respect and closed the conversation. So why do we think explaining ourselves is being considerate when it actually destroys respect? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You over-explain because you're desperate for approval, and everyone can smell that desperation. Greene spent his life studying power dynamics, and what he discovered was this. Society doesn't respect people who constantly justify themselves. We respect people who are secure enough to act without needing our approval, because they prove that everything we've been taught about owing people explanations is actually training us to seek permission for our own lives. But here's what Greene knew that nobody talks about. The person who refuses to explain isn't being rude. They're operating from a completely different level of self-authority. While everyone else is seeking approval through explanation, they've realized that respect and explanation are inversely related. And that realization, that's exactly what will change how people see you. But to understand why, we need to dig into the psychology of power that makes people more uncomfortable than anything else. Greene wrote, "When you show yourself to the world and display your talents, you naturally stir all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity. But what happens when you stop displaying your reasoning and simply act? If you've ever felt exhausted from justifying yourself, this video is for you. Like, subscribe, and let's command respect through silence. Leave a comment about the last time you refused to explain yourself and noticed how people's respect increased. That's the person who never explains themselves. They're a walking contradiction that breaks social expectations, makes decisions without seeking consensus, takes actions without justifying them, lives their life without defending their choices, sets boundaries without lengthy explanations, says no without listing reasons, changes direction without announcing why. And this terrifies us because if you don't need to explain yourself, if your authority doesn't require justification, if your decisions don't need our approval, then what does that say about all the explaining you've been doing to earn respect? You're actually destroying through explanation. But here's where it gets really interesting. Greene discovered something that explains why explanation destroys respect while silence creates it. And it has everything to do with perceived power. Remember that shift in respect you feel when someone refuses to justify themselves? Greene had a name for it. And once you understand what it is, you'll never over-explain again. Quick question. When was the last time you made a decision and simply stood by it without explaining your reasoning? Not because you couldn't explain, not because the explanation was too complex, but because you understood that explanations undermine authority. Can't remember? That's the problem. Greene discovered that our compulsion to explain isn't about being considerate. It's about seeking approval, because we don't believe our decisions are valid on their own merit. He called this the appearance of power versus actual power. Those who explain are seeking permission. Those who don't are operating from authority. And in power dynamics, explanation always signals insecurity. But here's what Greene knew. We over-explain our decisions. We justify our choices. We defend our actions before anyone even questions them. Not because it creates respect, but because we're terrified of being seen as wrong, unreasonable, or difficult. Think about your last boundary. Did you simply state it? Or did you provide a lengthy justification, hoping that if you explained enough, people would accept it without resistance? The person who commands respect doesn't explain their boundaries. They state them and move on. And somehow, this is the part that breaks people's brains. Their boundaries are violated far less than yours because they didn't invite negotiation through explanation. Green wrote, "The moment of victory is often the moment of greatest peril. What makes you over-explain is fear that your decision won't stand on its own, that people won't respect you unless you justify yourself, that you need their approval for your choices to be valid. But what if the explanation itself is the thing destroying your authority? What if every word you say to justify yourself is actually evidence you don't believe in your own decision?" Here's what the communication experts don't want you to know. Every explanation weakens your position. Everything you've been taught about owing people explanations is designed to keep you seeking approval. Green wrote, "If you are unsure of your course, you are lost. When you explain, you reveal uncertainty. When you justify, you invite debate. When you defend, you admit your position is attackable. The powerful understand something most people never access. Authority is assumed, never explained. While you're building elaborate justifications, they're simply acting. While you're defending your choices, they're making their choices reality through execution. While you're seeking approval through explanation, they're demonstrating through action that approval was never required. This is why your over-explaining keeps you powerless. You're not building respect. You're revealing insecurity. Remember Amanda from the meeting? While Marcus's unexplained decision commanded immediate respect and action, Amanda's lengthy justification made everyone question whether she actually knew what she was doing. Her consideration was actually perceived as weakness. Green called this Law 4. Always say less than necessary. The more you explain, the more ordinary you appear. The less you say, the more profound and powerful you seem. But here's the really crazy part. Silence after a decision feels uncomfortable. It feels rude. It feels like you're being difficult. And that's exactly the social conditioning designed to keep you explaining, keep you seeking approval, keep you undermining your own authority through desperate justification. Green believed that do not leave your reputation to chance or gossip. It is your life's artwork, and you must craft it, hone it, and display it with the care of an artist. The person who refuses to explain has crafted something untouchable. Their decisions stand on demonstrated competence, not defended reasoning. And that crafted authority gives them access to respect that over-explainers can never command. Now we get to the real reason society teaches you to explain yourself constantly. And it's not what you think. This isn't about consideration. This is about control. Green wrote, "The best deceptions are the ones that seem to give the other person a choice. But teaching you to explain yourself constantly isn't giving you choice. It's training you to seek permission for your own life. Think about it. Our entire social system depends on one belief, that you owe others explanations for your choices. You need to justify why you can't attend. You need to explain why you chose differently. You need to defend your boundaries with lengthy reasoning. The person who refuses to explain looks at this system and asks one simple question. Why do I need anyone's approval for my own decisions? And nobody has a good answer. They have authority without approval seeking, decisions without justification, boundaries without lengthy defenses. This makes them powerful. Powerful people are threatening to systems built on keeping everyone seeking permission. But here's the deeper fear that keeps the explanation culture alive. What if refusing to explain actually generates more respect? What if silence commands more authority than elaborate justification? What if people who don't defend themselves are harder to manipulate? If that's true, then millions of people have been destroying their own authority through consideration that's actually weakness. They've been explaining, justifying, and defending in ways that guaranteed they'd never command respect. The person who refuses to explain represents proof that there's another way. A way that doesn't require constant justification or endless defense. Green observed, Never appear too perfect. Appearing better than others is always dangerous, but most dangerous of all is to appear to have no faults or weaknesses. But the person who refuses to explain isn't claiming perfection. They're claiming authority over their own life, and that authority doesn't match what society needs from compliant people. But here's where this gets personal, because Green himself analyzed countless examples of what happens when people refuse to explain versus those who over-justify. Robert Greene spent decades studying power dynamics throughout history, and his research proves this. Leaders who explained constantly were seen as weak. Figures who over-justified were never respected. History records the fate of those who sought approval through explanation. They were controlled, manipulated, and ultimately disregarded. Greene documented countless examples of powerful figures who understood silence, successful people who refused to justify, leaders who commanded respect through unexplained certainty. Sound familiar? That's exactly the pattern today between people who command respect and people who can't. But here's what Greene knew from studying history. He had identified something crucial. That explanation and authority are inversely proportional. That the more you justify, the less people respect you. That silence after decision-making is the signature of power. And from that research came insights that changed how people understand authority. The 48 laws of power, the importance of strategic silence, the weakness of over-explanation, the authority of unexplained action. All of these concepts shape how we understand respect and power today. They all emerged from studying what actually generates respect versus what destroys it. This is the pattern throughout history's most respected figures. They appeared mysterious because they didn't explain everything. Churchill rarely justified his decisions. Steve Jobs didn't defend his vision with elaborate reasoning. Powerful leaders throughout time understood that explanation invites questioning while certainty commands respect. But conventional wisdom calls this being difficult because people who don't explain can't be easily controlled. The person who refuses to explain today is following the same pattern. And just like history's most respected figures, they're not trying to be liked through considerate explanation. They're commanding respect through demonstrated competence and unexplained certainty, and that refusal to justify looks arrogant to people who've been trained to constantly seek approval. Here's what Greene knew from studying power dynamics. The person who constantly explains isn't being considerate. They're revealing that they don't believe in their own authority. But maybe you're starting to recognize yourself in this description. Maybe you've been over-explaining your entire life. Greene wrote, "The key to power is the ability to judge who is best able to further your interests in all situations. But judging when explanation serves you requires recognizing these signs. Let me show you these signs. If you recognize them, understanding this will transform how you communicate. First sign, you explain your decisions before anyone asks. Traditional considerate people preemptively justify to avoid conflict. You announce a decision and immediately follow with reasons, addressing objections that haven't been raised. You defend before being attacked. That's not consideration. That's revealing you don't believe your decision stands on its own merit. Second sign, your explanations get longer when people question you. Powerful people's answers get shorter under questioning. Your explanations expand, trying harder to convince as resistance increases. Someone pushes back and you add more justification, more reasoning, more defense. Sound familiar? That's not being thorough. That's revealing uncertainty through escalating explanation. Third sign, you feel guilty when you can't provide a good explanation. You make decisions based on intuition, pattern recognition, or information you can't articulate. When asked to explain and you can't provide logical reasoning, you feel invalid. You question your own decision because you can't justify it to others. Fourth sign, people negotiate with your boundaries because your explanations invite debate. You set a boundary and then explain why, providing the logic someone can argue against. Every explanation becomes ammunition for negotiation. Your boundaries with lengthy justifications are violated constantly, while unexplained boundaries are respected. Fifth sign, you've noticed that when you accidentally don't explain, people respect you more. Sometimes you forget to justify, or you're too busy to explain, or you just state something and move on. In those moments, people accept your decision without question. The less you said, the more authority you commanded. Sixth sign, your explanations often include phrases like, "Does that make sense?" or "Is that okay?" You end justifications, seeking approval. You explain and then check if your reasoning was acceptable. You're literally asking permission for decisions you've already made. Seventh sign, you feel more powerful when you stop explaining but guilty for not being considerate. You experiment with simply stating decisions without justification. It feels powerful but wrong, like you're being difficult. The guilt you feel for not explaining is actually your conditioning telling you that you're claiming authority you were taught to never assume. You've been taught these are signs you're inconsiderate. You've been told that good people explain themselves, that consideration requires justification, that not defending yourself is rude. Green would tell you to stop listening. He'd tell you that over-explanation is the signature of powerlessness, not consideration. When you stop justifying yourself and start simply acting with certainty, you gain access to genuine respect. Not the false respect people give you for being agreeable and easy to control, but real respect that comes from demonstrated authority that doesn't need defense. This is why powerful people speak less. When you're not exhausting yourself justifying every decision, your words carry more weight. This is why their boundaries are respected. When you don't invite negotiation through explanation, people accept your limits without debate. But accepting this truth, that you command more respect through silence than through explanation, that's the hardest part. Now comes the practical question. How do you stop explaining yourself in a world that demands constant justification? Green believed that the moment of victory is often the moment of greatest peril. In the heat of victory, arrogance and overconfidence can push you past the goal you had aimed for, and by going too far, you make more enemies than you defeat. But once you understand that explanation weakens you, you need a framework for strategic silence. First, practice the complete answer. When someone questions your decision, answer once, briefly, and completely. Then stop. If they push for more explanation, repeat your answer in fewer words or simply say, "I've made my decision." The complete answer respects the question, but doesn't invite endless negotiation. Powerful people answer questions, they just don't over-explain. Second, distinguish between explanation and information. Information adds value. We're leaving at 6 a.m. because that's when the train departs. Explanation seeks approval. We're leaving at 6 a.m. because I thought it would be better, and I know it's early, but I figured we could, and I hope that's okay. Provide necessary information. Never seek approval through explanation. Third, develop what Green called strategic opacity. Not everything requires transparency. "I've decided to decline" is sufficient. You don't owe anyone access to your reasoning process. When pressed, "It doesn't work for me" is a complete answer. Your internal decision-making process is yours alone. But here's the most important part. You have to tolerate the discomfort of not explaining. Society has trained you to fill silence with justification. The powerful have trained themselves to let silence create authority. Someone questions your decision and you feel pressure to explain. Don't. Let the discomfort exist. That discomfort is the space where respect forms. The moment you break and start explaining, you've revealed that their discomfort controls you. But Nietzsche understood something deeper. To use the same words is not a sufficient guarantee of understanding. One must use the same words for the same genus of inward experience. Ultimately, one must have one's experiences in common. You don't need to explain yourself to people who will never understand. Your real power might require refusing to justify yourself repeatedly. Your authority might need you to let people be uncomfortable with your unexplained decisions. Your respect might have to be commanded through certainty rather than earned through justification. And that's not being difficult. That's understanding power dynamics. Think about it. Every person who commanded real respect was comfortable leaving people without explanations. Green documented this pattern across centuries. Those who explained constantly were forgotten or controlled. Those who maintained strategic silence were remembered as powerful. But when their competence spoke louder than any explanation could, everything about their refusal to justify suddenly made sense. Their supposed difficulty turned out to be the only way to maintain authority. The same pattern happens over and over. The person everyone called difficult for not explaining suddenly reveals competence that makes explanation unnecessary. Because while everyone else was justifying to seek approval, they were executing to demonstrate capability. While others were explaining decisions, they were making decisions reality. While others were defending themselves, they were building track records that defended themselves. Here's what nobody tells you about refusing to explain yourself. Your authority will solidify, but some people will call you difficult. Let me say it again. Green wrote, "When you show yourself to the world and display your talents, you naturally stir all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity. You've been refusing to seek approval while everyone else explains themselves into powerlessness. You've been commanding respect through silence while they've been destroying it through justification, and that refusal gives you something over-explanation can never provide, the ability to make decisions without consensus, to set boundaries without negotiation, to command respect without seeking permission. But your authority won't be comfortable for everyone. It won't fit the considerate person narrative that people prefer. Instead, some will call you difficult, mysterious, or hard to read. The people who need to control you through guilt will call you inconsiderate. The people who want to negotiate your boundaries will call you inflexible. The people who can't manipulate you through social pressure will call you difficult. And that's perfect, because those are exactly the people whose respect you don't need. When the right moment comes, all the times you refuse to explain will reveal themselves as the foundation of your authority. Every time you stated a decision without justification was actually you claiming authority over your own life. Every boundary you set without lengthy defense was actually you teaching people how to respect you. Society teaches constant explanation because compliant people are easier to control through guilt and social pressure. They prove that maybe the problem isn't difficult people who won't explain. Maybe the problem is a culture that pathologizes authority and tries to force everyone into constantly seeking approval through justification. If you're someone who's tired of explaining yourself, if your decisions are solid regardless of whether others understand, if you've been called difficult despite commanding more respect than considerate over-explainers, Green would recognize you immediately. You're not inconsiderate. You're not difficult. You're not being rude. You're understanding that explanation and authority are inversely related, and you're choosing respect over approval. The question isn't whether you should be more considerate. The question is whether you'll have the courage to stop explaining yourself even when people demand justification. Because Green was right about power dynamics. The more you explain, the weaker you appear. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make your decision, state it once, and refuse to justify it no matter how uncomfortable that makes people. Even when the world calls that being difficult, the person who refuses to explain isn't society's problem. They're proof that real respect comes from authority, not from seeking approval through endless justification. And that's exactly why approval-seeking people fear them. If this video made you see communication differently, or if you recognize yourself as someone exhausted from over-explaining, let me know in the comments. What changed when you stopped justifying yourself? And if you want more content that teaches you the psychology of power and respect, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started with truths about authority that considerate people don't want you to hear.